Hello and welcome to the Omniscien Technologies webinar. What is deep neural machine translation and how can it be applied? My name is Dion Wiggins. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Omniscien, and I'm joined today by our Chief Scientist, Philipp Koehn, who will be leading most of the presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them during the call using the question tool, and we will try and answer them as much as possible at the end. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Philipp.
Okay, so we have this outline lined up. I'll give a bit of an introduction what is deep learning and how it differs from other learning methods that have been explored so far. I'll give a quick review about neural machine translation, and then what does that mean together? What is deep neural machine translation? And then Dion Wiggins will talk about how to apply that in the real world and actual performance numbers we observed. We'll conclude with a question and answer session. Next slide. So the big point of machine learning is to depart from the, as you might call, the rational approach to solving a problem. So typically in computer science, if you have to solve a problem and implement a solution, you first take a really close look at the problem, analyze it, and then figure out what kind of rules or processes have to be employed to solve the problem. And then when you have that figured out, you implement the solution. In contrast, in data-driven approaches, you do not do that. You just collect a lot of examples of input and output and just have a general sense of the problem structure and then use a general purpose learning algorithm. There are many areas where this is a more reasonable approach because you just cannot find the exact rules that govern a certain domain. For instance, natural language, which we are dealing with, but if you look at Google's self-driving car efforts, these are all examples where you can't just write clear-cut rules and analyze them. So data-driven approaches are more appropriate. Next slide. The machine learning field has been dominated by learning approaches. These differ quite a bit over the years. The initial statistical machine translation systems that were proposed were oriented around translating of words. The real breakthrough in kind of commercial availability and good enough quality for many purposes were phrase-based models, and the most recent incarnation of statistical MT uses syntactic structure. What all of these have in common is that when you go over the training data, you try to estimate probability distributions. So for instance, if a word occurs 100 times and was translated 20 ways in one way, that means that's a 20% probability. And that number is being used as a score in the model. Next slide. In machine learning, the key to success is that you have to analyze the problem and then come up with really good features. So for instance, in machine translation, a lot of work has been going into what kind of features are relevant for word order. For instance, reordering might be more driven by grammatical constraints, by knowing what a verb and an object is. Noun phrases, prepositional phrases, all these things might be useful to determine how to order changes when you translate from one language to the other. Or what features are relevant for lexical translation. That might be, of course, just really much based on the dictionary, but we also know that words in a narrow context or domain are relevant to figure out what the correct translation for a word is in a given context. Next slide. The promise of neural networks is that we can forego some of this feature engineering. So instead of having the input and then come up with features that represent the input most appropriately, we just have a generic hidden layer that automatically discovers features and then generates the output from there. So the idea is really that you have a very, very general solution, only have input-output pairs, and do not spend a lot of time coming up with proper feature, proper balancing of rich information and poor information, proper weighting of examples that occur maybe once but are very close to what you translate, all the things I just talked about part of speech tags and verb phrases, maybe all that can be forgotten and all is discovered automatically by the neural network. Next slide. Deep learning is basically a refinement of neural learning and has become quite popular in recent years. It really just means that instead of just having one hidden representation, you have several layers of hidden representations before you get to the output. So this allows to compute even more complex interaction between features. This approach obviously has been around for a while, but it really just became practical recently with faster computing on GPUs. The big breakthrough that kind of started the tidal wave of deep learning in the field of artificial intelligence was, for instance, vision, where you had images and you try to recognize images. And here you can actually probe some of these hidden representations. You get a similar representations as you have in the human brain. So the first layers do edge detection, the middle layers try to find general patterns or shapes, and then only the further layers down there do things like recognizing faces or dogs or the actual task of understanding what is in the image. These kind of techniques now have also been applied to natural language processing and machine translation. Okay, moving on. Just to give you one example of features in machine translation, they're obviously words. One important step is that you map words from one language to the other. But if you really analyze the problem, you realize that you're going to get some benefits by treating morphological variants of the same lemma. Similarly, if you know how to translate the word car and the word cars, you maybe want to employ a morphological stemma and then saying the lemma is translated, the inflection is translated separately. You might also group together words of similar syntactic type, so you know where nouns and proper names occur in a text. And we also seen a success with clustering words together by semantics. If words have similar meaning, then you can have some benefit about how to place them in a sentence, for instance. Another thing that we noticed is that you get better translation performance if you translate phrases and not individual words. So grouping words together seems to be an important thing as well. Next slide. In contrast, in neural machine translation, you do not do all this work of trying to figure out how different words relate. Here's a bit of a screenshot of these word cloud type pictures that have become popular. It's a representation of a word embedding that is automatically learned by a natural language processing system. Each word is represented by a high dimensional vector. In machine translation, for instance, we typically use vectors of size 500. So it's really 500 real valued numbers. This is now projected down to 2 dimensions, so you can actually look at it. But you see that words that are similar actually end up in a very, very similar representation. Growing, developing is close to each other. Words related to sport, like run and hit, are close to each other. Aired, broadcast are close to each other. So what these word embeddings seem to be doing in these middle layers, hidden layers of the neural network, is discover some semantic properties of words. Next slide. Here is a sketch of the entire architecture of a neural machine translation system. It might look a bit complicated with all the colors, so let me walk through that a bit slowly. So it starts with, on the next slide, with the input embeddings of the words. So each word is projected into this representation we just saw. So here you have some kind of sense of semantic representation of the words. However, this is without any context. So these are just the representation of words, no matter where they occur in a sentence. Next slide. At the end, the translation system has to produce output words, and these are produced one by one. Basically, each word is predicted based on pretty much everything you see on the picture, all the input words, all the previous words, and all that other stuff in the middle. Next slide. The output words are produced by a decoder layer. So decoder layer here is to be understood as an encoder-decoder metaphor, that the information that comes from the input is encoded and then in the decoder gets decoded. So the decoder progresses through the sentence, and each time step it produces an output word. And the decoder is informed by previous decoder steps, by the input context, and by the previously produced output words. So next slide. The input context is a representation of the input sentence, but in a fixed vector. So this is kind of a computational reason. So you have a sequence of output words, but you try to use it as input to the decoder, so it has to be all crammed down into one single vector. The way this is done is by computing what we call attention, which could be understood as a word alignment. So how much at this point, which words should I pay attention more to than others? It is a software alignment that it says, for instance, I pay 10% attention to the first word and 20% attention to the third word and 50% attention to the fourth word. And then based on these attention weights, I sum up a computer weighted sum of the encoder layer. This is then compressed into a single vector to represent the input. The benefits of neural machine translation is that each output word is predicted from the encoding of the full input sentence and all previously produced output words. In contrast, in statistical machine translation, we had much stronger independence assumptions. We had translation rules that you looked at single words or short phrases during mapping, and you had a language model that looked at the previous words in the output. But here we actually have full view of the entire input and all the produced output at all times, and it can impact translation. And you see some of the benefits of neural machine translation that is very good at creating long distance phenomena like German verb constructions where suffixes are still produced properly even if there are 10 words removed. The word embeddings we talked about are also very good at allowing this generalization. For instance, that cat and cats have very similar representation. House and home have similar representation. So these are both syntactic relationships and semantic relationships. So after all I said about deep learning and neural machine translation, it is relatively straightforward what deep neural machine translation means. So this is again the picture of neural machine translation. You see there various layers of processing. So in a way, it's already somewhat deep. You don't directly map from an input word to an output word. You have the encoder layer, you have the decoder layer, and you have the intention mechanism in the middle. Deep models would imply to add a few more layers. So one option is to have a deeper encoder layer. So instead of just going from the input to the encoder layer, to have several encoder layers. This is able then to find more complex relationships between the input words. So the whole purpose of the encoder layer is to have a bit more refined representation of the input in context. So you don't have the word in isolation anymore, you consider its context. And the more layers you have here, the more complex relationships you can compute. Next slide. Similarly, you can put on the decoder layer also more layers. So instead of having a single decoder layer, you have several decoder layers. So all these pictures here are rough sketches of what is going on. There are various design decisions, how to really set them up. For instance, for the encoder, we often do left to right and right to left. How exactly these layers proceed from each other. For instance, if these arrows just go top to down, or also from left to right in all layers, is one of these questions that have to be resolved and have to be found out experimentally. What is really the best working methods? Next slide. So if you compare deep and shallow neural machine translation, one obvious thing is that there are more computation steps. That does enable more complex interactions between the different properties of a sentence, but it also means that the training is harder. One simple fact is that the distance between the input signal and the output signal is now much more distant. There are much more processing steps in the middle. So if you, for instance, have during training, a training example where the machine translation system came up with the wrong word translation, that information has to now propagate it now, not just directly to the input, but through very, very many layers of input. And it's always difficult to make sure that it doesn't get lost at the wrong place. Training is also harder simply for the fact that there are more parameters and more numbers that have to be set properly. That alone leads to longer training times. To deal with all that, there's a lot of ongoing work right now, various refinements, things like shortcut connections, dropout, layer normalization. In the next slide, I have a quick illustration of shortcut connections. Next slide. So since training through all these different layers is really tricky, it might make sense to also have additional connections between the input directly to the last encoder layer, so to bypass all these intermediate decoder layers that early in training are really hard to set. And once it properly has a good model with these skip connections, it can then proceed and learn more refined representations in the intermediate layers. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Philip. So that's the technical part of the presentation. As you can see, deep neural machine translation is a little bit more complex. So I'm now going to talk about how this is applied in the real world and what kinds of things that you need to be aware of and how to proceed and what are the benefits. So first of all, there are 5 things that are important to understand with any pure neural MT system. First of all, NMT systems have a lower quality out of domain. Often they will just produce complete gibberish if the input is not relevant to what the engine was trained on. They have a steeper learning curve. That means that you need larger volumes and higher quality data. So that means it's less suitable for low resource languages. Yet it is also very suitable for some of the low resource languages that are much more complex, such as Finnish and languages like that. The systems work at a subword level, and so they perform better than SMT in many cases, but there's also weaknesses in translating low frequency words or highly inflected words. So that's a challenge. NMT systems also have lower translation quality with very short or very long sentences. And finally, the attention model that Philip mentioned does not always fulfill the role of a word alignment model, but there are some differences there, and so they need to be managed. So we looked at that as part of the Omniscien team as a group, and Philip and myself and the other team members came up with what we call hybrid NMT. This is a combination of neural and statistical machine translation, and both approaches have strengths and weaknesses. So what we found was that using both approaches, we were able to overcome many of the weaknesses between the two of them. So in this case, a large number of sentences were passed through in the patent domain going English to Japanese, and we found that about 65% were better using NMT, about 27 or 28% were roughly the same, and 7 or 8% SMT was better. So the challenge then is switching between them. So what we did was, in our hybrid model, this is greatly simplifying it. There's a lot of complex scoring and word alignment and understanding and so on. But we made the two systems work hand in hand. So we know very quickly that a short sentence is not going to do well and a long one isn't going to work well. So we worked on an algorithm that determined what is a short and what is a long. We then built that into the workflow at runtime. And then what happens is, if a sentence goes through NMT, it's then measured for quality. If that quality is low, so the sentence might have been out of domain, for example, so you get gibberish, it will then fall back to SMT. Now, when it falls back to SMT, it has a choice. It can make a decision. Is the SMT better or is the NMT better, and pick the best one. So that's the very, very high level workflow. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, and you can merge some of the outputs sometimes as well. But that just gives you an idea of the rough workflow. By combining a hybrid and a statistical system together as one singular system, you get a much higher quality. And we're now producing most of our new engines for our customers in this manner. Now, when it comes to training times, So SMT, for a reasonable volume of data, you're typically talking 1 to 2 days of training. With NMT, we've got that down to 1 day or less. And with Deep NMT, we've got that down to about 5 days. Now, incremental training or adaptation for SMT is about 1 to 2 hours, about 4 hours with NMT, and about a day with Deep NMT. However, there are some cases in NMT and Deep NMT where we can actually do this incremental training in a matter of minutes. Now, one thing to be cautious of, you should expect that some MT vendors will be selling instant updating. It's not the same thing as a full adaptation to a big corpus, but some will try and brand it as such. They're very, very different things. Okay, so when you're training a system, a lot of the same data can be used for statistical and neural. Your translation memories, your dictionaries and glossaries, and your do not translate lists can all fall into this category that they can be used in both. Obviously, quality of content is important, and we've been promoting for about 10 years now a method called Clean Data SMT, and obviously that carries over into Clean Data NMT. It's a really simple thing that all computers rely on, which is a basic principle of garbage in, garbage out. So the higher quality of data that you feed into the system, the higher quality translations you'll get out. Now, the monolingual data that normally a language model for SMT would be trained on, that is not reusable in NMT at this time. So basically, you only have the bilingual data to work on with NMT. As such, statistical tools often can do better with out-of-domain content because they can rely on the language model to help. So when we build a system, we're fully aware that many of our customers don't have a lot of data. In fact, some of our customers have no data at all. Now, what we're able to do in all scenarios is what we call data manufacturing. So we create data that's in domain, it's high quality, and it matches what the customer is intending to translate. So that then goes together with other linguistic processes to generate terminology and various other things. It's a cooperative effort between the customer and ourselves. We do about 95% of the work, and then we come back to our customers for about 5%, such as determining terminology. While we can extract terminology, we can't tell you how your customer would prefer it to be translated, those kinds of things. Now, customization is key. I recently published a blog that went into this in a lot more detail. It's on our website, and I would encourage everybody to have a look. But it shows very clearly that a focused engine built on sufficient data will always be higher quality. So generic engines like Google and so on, they'll do very well on generic content. However, the moment you want to go into something that's specialized or you require quality, you have problems. They're lacking control. So if you translate something like a hotel review, you might do okay. If you translate an engineering manual for an airplane, it probably won't do very well. And if you translate marketing content, it probably won't do very well. So there's big differences. Now, one of the problems with a generic engine that's different with a customized engine is the confusion and ambiguity of large volumes of data that are not relevant. So if I say, for example, I went to the bank, what context is that in? I've given 3 contexts here. The water was cold and the current strong. I went to the bank, my feet sunk into the mud. So clearly that's a riverbank. Or I'd run out of cash, I went to the bank, it had just closed. So this is banking in the context of finance. And finally, I was in the lead of the last lap in the final turn. I went to the bank, the G-force pulled me down in the seat, so I'm racing a car. The machine doesn't know that context. But when you customize, you can teach it the context of what you're planning to translate. And that's where a generic engine breaks down and a customized engine really makes a big difference. Now, earlier this year, we trained a system, and it was based on 1 million sentences of content English to Japanese in life sciences. Now, we compared that to Google and Bing, and Bing in this case got a blue score of 23. Google got a blue score of 31.74. Now, our shallow NMT, that got a blue score of 36.55, and on the exact same data, we got another 12 blue points by changing to Deep NMT. This is a significant jump. There was no change in the data. The only difference was changing the training technology from neural to deep. And in doing so, it went down extra layers, as Philipp described, learned more, and was therefore able to do a higher quality translation. We then turned that data around and went back the other way. So Bing in that case scored 17, Google 26. We scored 28 as neural, just a little bit better than Google. But once we went to deep, it was notably better. Now, one thing to note here, Google is already using deep for a very long time. So, this is the difference between focusing an engine for customization and using something generic. Now, if you're translating as a human, you want the highest quality that is relevant to what you're translating, that requires the least amount of effort in order to publish. So that's where customization comes in. Now, further exploring this, here's another example. So this is English to German and German to English. Now, Google has approximately the same amount of bilingual patent data that we have. Okay, so roughly 12 million sentences of English-German bilingual patent data. Now, Google, of course, also has many other domains mixed in, whereas we focused our engine purely on patent translations. Now, what you can see here, in this case, is Google got a blue score of 39.5, and because we were focused, we were able to get a blue score of 43. And going back the other way, Google got a blue score of 52, and we got a blue score of nearly 59. So you can see that mixing in other content confuses things because it makes them ambiguous. And then you fall down to probabilities of what gets translated most often. So I went to the bank. Well, most of the time I'm probably talking about finance. So you get the finance translation. MT systems today don't take into context the entire document. They only take into context the sentence you're translating now. So as a result, the rest of the document is not considered. So any MT engine only considers the sentence at hand. Therefore, context has to be based on either the most frequent or what it's trained on. So in summary, SMT is still alive and well, and it will continue to be a very viable technology for some time to come, either standalone for less common languages where the data is not really available, so lower resource. NMT and Deep NMT go a long way to improving quality, but they're not the only solution. Combining with SMT is often a big help. Real-world scenarios require more control than a generic engine can provide. And Deep NMT is here now. It's notably better, okay? We've seen the results and our customers are loving it today. More data is not the solution to higher quality. Clean in-domain data is the solution. And data manufacturing is a key part of that process. So with that, I'm going to open up to some of the questions, and we've got a number of questions already. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and we can try and answer as many as we can. So first question we have, how can terminology be used for training of deep neural networks? Can it be done, and what are the challenges? So Philipp, I'll pass that over to you.
So we can basically do the same thing as we did for statistical MT. So one is to just add to the training data and let it pick up this way. But if you really want to enforce terminology to constrain then decoding to whenever that particular source word occurs to produce a particular target word. It is a bit more trickier in neural MT because, as Dion already pointed out, the attention mechanism is not as reliable as word alignment was in statistical MT. So it might happen that during the translation, it just never attends to the source word, so it never actually is then forced to produce a target translation. So we have various refinements to this idea. So this is something we currently have deployed, that you can produce, specify a translation with terminology or must translate this way or that way instructions along with the input. And it works relatively well.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. What are the linguistic aspects where you see the major improvements of deep neural versus neural?
We generally see really nice improvements in just general overall fluency of sentences. That was already a big step forward from statistical MT to neural MT. Statistical MT often reads really clean, if you just look at neighboring words, but then if you look at the overall sentence, it's entirely ungrammatical. So with neural NT, we see this very often perfectly grammatical output. And this is even more so the case with deep neural NT. So there's various languages where you have nested constructions, expressions like switch the light on, and then to produce the output where you produce the word switch, and then some intermediate words, and then the word on is really difficult. But this is something that neural and deep neural MT seems to be handling much better.
Okay, great, thank you. And one for me, I can answer the next one. How do you measure NMT quality in hybrid mode? So in hybrid mode, the way we measure NMT quality is we've built a proprietary algorithm that actually analyzes the quality of the translation. So it's looking at how many words, obviously lengthwise. It's looking at other different algorithms that look at the overall quality, grammatical correctness, and many other things to determine that the quality is a good translation or a bad translation, and gives it a score. Once it has that score on NMT, it compares the same metric on SMT to make its decisions. Okay, next question. So do you think DNMT is able to cope with named entities better than rule-based or statistical?
It depends. I mean, the translation of named entities is for some languages trivial because you just map the source word to the target word. For other languages where you have different writing systems, if you translate from Arabic or Chinese to English, name translation is actually really difficult. So for those cases, you either have a large repository of name translations or you learn so-called transliteration models where you map characters to characters. This is very often handled as a separate component. In neural MT, we already have a very generic component of taking words we don't know and breaking them up into pieces. So it's basically already within the general system that it can translate names that we've never seen before, still properly from one language to the other. So there seems to be some benefits to that, having it not as a separate component. Otherwise, I think this is somewhat independent of the technology, a research challenge of creating large repositories of names, translations of names into various languages, getting the phonetics right. So it's something that is more like a data collection effort outside the core technology.
Okay, great. So next question again, I'll take this one. So how does a business person pick the right approach to their problem domain and context? So very good question. What we generally do with our customers is the vast majority of our customers don't know how to customize an engine, and that's where we specialize. So when we customize an engine, the first thing we do is we have an online meeting with our customers and we sit down to understand their goals, and then we design what's called a quality improvement plan, which is published as part of their engine, which says these are the things we're going to do and these are the technologies and approaches and domains we're going to use. We then work with the customer to execute that. And again, we do about 95% of the work, and we fall back to the customer for anything language specific, like choosing specified terminology that perhaps isn't in the training data, but we know you're going to need. So we guide you through the entire process. That's what we call a professional custom engine. Okay. So next question. So sorry, there's way too many questions coming in now, which is very good. Okay, at this step, is it possible to perform many-to-many translations using one network shape, i.e. input hidden layers, output, or similar?
Yeah, I should take that one. So this also asking the question, what many-to-many seems to imply, many input languages, maybe output languages. So in statistical MT, we always trained separate engines for different language pairs. So in German, English, we had a completely different system than for French, Spanish, and so on. It is actually possible for neural MT to learn models on several language pairs at the same time. There seem to be even some benefits to doing this if you have a lot of resources in one language pair, and then you have much less resources, but in very related languages. So if you have a large Russian-English translation system, you might actually just start with that, add a little bit Ukrainian English data, and then have a much better Ukrainian English translation model than just training on the Ukrainian English data by itself. So you can do this on the input and the output. It's not something that's generally done, but there have been some evidence that this is actually a good idea.
Okay, great. Next one, word embeddings that allow generalization do not make distinction between similarity of words based on morphology alone or semantic relationships. How does the system translate a singular and not a plural, for example, cat versus cats?
So I illustrated the similarity in this two-dimensional plot, which is a gross simplification. So what is really happening in these word embeddings that these are, in our case, typically 500-dimensional vectors. So in some of these dimensions are then relevant for morphology. Some of the dimensions are responsible for more semantic relationships. So people probing these kind of representations have, for instance, seen that the relationship between words between singular in the singular and plural forms all have very similar distances. So it learns the general principle of plural forming. But you can also look at the semantics of a word, and you see similar kind of words that have similar semantics clustered together. This is kind of a open question how powerful these really are. Currently, research in natural language processing is quite excited about these word embeddings. The belief that these reveal something about the semantics of words and can even then be used to represent the meaning of sentences and so on. So there's a lot of excitement and interesting research going on right now.
Okay, great. Okay, so also one of the questions was, can you talk more about the scores mentioned on the slides other than blue? So in the slides, we use a number of different scores. So that they're very common industry-based scores. So if measure, Levenstein, and TER. Levenstein, you might also have heard of as edit distance. Okay, it's the number of inserts, deletes, and movements. If measure is about recall, and TER is another metric about translation error rate. If you look on Wikipedia or various other sources, you'll find very deep and in-depth information there. So I won't go into too much depth here. Okay, for many-to-many translations, is there any data set available taking into account more than pair languages?
Not sure exactly what that means. I mean, there are data sets that are really truly multilingual. The European Parliament, the United Nations have data sets where you have the same content expressed in several languages. So these would be examples of training data that you can use to train kind of a many-to-many system.
Okay, great. So one question, is it possible to switch from existing SMT engines to neural engines without training or without new training by the user? So the answer to that one is no. Obviously, you need to train the NMT component, but your SMT component can be used as part of that without having to retrain that. Okay, and with that, I think we're generally running out of questions. One more. So if you have any questions left, please jump in. So the attention mechanism in NMT, does it perform better than common word alignment tools like Giza or FastAlign?
That's a good question. So it's a bit tricky to compare these. So they generally haven't been used to measure just alignment error rate. So one way to measure this is to just have handwritten word alignments and then see how well these methods match them. If you start doing handwritten word alignments, you get very quickly into all the kind of hard problems, what to do with function words that don't really translate and so on. I did spend quite a bit of time in comparing word alignments that come out of Giza++ and word alignments as they are in the attention mechanism, and they do generally map really well. So the key difference is that with the Giza traditional word alignments, we really try to establish fixed connections between one input word and an output word, or multiple words when that is appropriate, while the neural system has these much more fuzzy alignments. So it pays some attention to one word and some other attention to another word. To give you an example, when it translates the verb, often the object or the subject might really help with disambiguating the word. And you see that then coming up when you look at the attention mechanism, that when it translates a verb, it not only looks at that verb, it also looks at the subject or the object word and uses that information as well. So that helps it then to disambiguate the source word a bit.
Okay.
Generally, the attention mechanism is kind of an internal step of the whole mechanism, so it's not meant to be an alignment, and we've even seen erratic cases where it produces very different things from than an alignment mechanism you would expect it to produce, but it still works.
Sure. Okay, excellent. With regards to hidden layers, which parameters of deep neural network can be controlled by the end user?
So there's something we call hyperparameters, which are just general properties of the model, like how many layers, how many nodes in each layer, how they're all connected up. That's the only thing you can really control. You can't control the parameters in the models. So there are millions and millions of numbers. It makes no sense to kind of tweak those numbers because the exact role is somewhat difficult to discern.
Right, I'll probably add a little bit to that. One of the things that we've been able to do with our platform is we've been able to support our traditional approaches that we had in statistical, where you could add runtime glossaries and non-translatable terms. So you are able to control the engine in that way by influencing the attention model by actually prescribing to something and saying, you will translate this way. So that's one area where you can control. Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. So I thank everyone for attending today, and we will make this recording available. We'll also put the questions and answers up on the web. So any questions that we've missed today or couldn't answer properly, we'll be able to answer online, and you'll see those in the next day or so online. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.